Rangers fans, welcome to Liberty Blue, the essential New York Rangers podcast. I'm Andrew Chelney alongside Nick Zararis. And Nick, it is the middle of August. The Olympics are over, and we are counting down the minutes at this point to hockey coming back once again.
We don't even have the WNBA right now. I just looked up. They're not even back till next week either. So we're really just kind of in the trenches with
baseball. You have NFL preseason?
Could not pay me to watch NFL preseason. It's not like back in the day where like the good players would play the first two games. Now the preseason in the NFL for actual players is the first 2 weeks of the regular season. And that's why you can't take September results with any real implications for the rest of the season. But yeah, there's not a lot going on. You know, the mailbags at the various publications are pretty dry at this point of the summer. Some people have started publishing early look aheads to like prospect rankings and draft positioning stuff. But for the most part, everybody's on vacation in the hockey universe. A few people I know who cover hockey were doing Olympic stuff, which was, you know, it'd be nice if we could get some hockey news. But I guess if no one's doing anything for an entire 8 weeks, I guess there's no news to report. But that lends itself to thinking. It lends itself to some creativity. And that's kind of the idea of today's show. I went out with my friends on Saturday night and we were talking, the usual riffs of, oh, well, what if that happened, if this had happened? And it brings up a good conversation topic because the Rangers have been very close now for the better part of a decade and a half. You know, you got a conference final appearance in 2011, one in 14, one in 15, one in 22, and then one in 24. You've been on the periphery a few times. You went to a final the one time. You've been right around the edges. And that naturally leads us to obsessing over things like, why did the Rangers trade Lee Stempniak for a bag of chips in December of 2014 when they very much could have used a fourth line winger? Well, he's too good for the fourth line, so we don't want to play him there. But wouldn't that indicate you think he would be helpful in a better role that you might need a top 9 forward for if an injury were to occur?
Also,
which is
that
ultimately
signifies
what
a
happened.
good team.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling that you have those types of decisions where all of these, and there are a whole bunch. The ones Andrew and I are going to discuss on tonight's episode, there's not all of them.
Yep.
None of these are individual game results. None of these are if this puck goes in or if that's not a penalty, because that's too nebulous because you don't know how the rest of that game is going to play out. All of these are transactions or hirings and firings. And the reason I chose to frame it through that lens is you can keep building off of it. You know, if they acquire this player and we're going to start them in a minute, then they don't need to go out and make this move down the road. Or if they keep this coach one more season and then he gets fired, these are the coaches that are available that off season. So there's a lot of permutations off of this. And I think if nothing else, this will make you exercise your brain a little bit in the middle of August, thinking about hockey in a way that's not just rankings from an aggregator site trying to garner social media interactions so they can show their supervisor that their strategy to develop engagement is working. You know, this is predicated in actual discussion. So I'm going to throw up the first one here, and everybody knows this one. Everybody is well aware of this one. This one has been reported. This one has been in multiple books. 2009. Everybody, I don't know if I can say everybody recalls. Steven Stamkos rookie year. For some reason, the Tampa Bay Lightning had hired Barry Melrose off of TV after not being in the NHL for an extended period of time to coach the team with the first overall pick. He did the typical old man hockey thing of, I'm healthy scratching you. You're going to learn how to play a 200-foot game. You need to be better if you want to be on this team, even though they had just picked first overall. And were very clearly not a good team. So they were just being a hard ass with the first overall pick for the sake of being a hard ass. That first season goes by. Stamkos plays like 50 some odd games. Doesn't do amazing, but very clearly a talented player goes first overall. The Rangers do a series abroad where they play Tampa Bay over in Europe, and Glenn Sather, then the general manager, corners the Tampa Bay Lightning owner and is more or less, what do you want for Stamkos? And they come to a laundry list. The excerpt that's on the screen, if you're watching on YouTube, is from a Larry Brooks article. This was in Bob McKenzie's book. This has been widely reported. Of that pool, you're assuming that it's probably some combination of Delzato, Callahan, Dubinsky, Girardi, Grachev, whatever. But you're assuming you're giving away at least 2 of those 5 guys and Grachev in picks. So let's start with that. You're getting 19-year-old Steven Stamkos. You are losing a first-pair defenseman and probably a top 6 forward in the case of Dubinsky or Callahan, all right, if you have Stamkos and you have Derek Stepan, you probably don't need to go and trade for Derek Brassard 2 years later. You probably don't need to go trade for Marty St. Louis 3 years later. And the build off of that keeps going, because if you have Stamkos and you're able to shed Girardi and Callahan, and I know that sounds crazy to say about guys who were like 23 and 24 at the time. I
think they still might trade for Marty St. Louis because of the connection.
I think it's possible, but you also have to think that I think the Lightning probably would have been a bit more sour about trading with the Rangers if they had just traded away Steven Stamkos, who, had 3 50-goal seasons by 2015. Somebody who very clearly was going to be an elite talent, just needed the right environment. But so much of the Rangers' issues in that window, that 2010 to 2015, it was defined by not having that superstar forward. You think about what a team with Steven Stamkos, and you don't need to go get Brad Richards. If you have Steven Stamkos, you have all of that flexibility.
For the record, I think Brad Richards was a good Ranger. I think
he was fine. It was just a bad contract.
Yeah.
He wasn't bad. It was a bad contract. They were able to get rid of it because of the amnesty rules, because the lockout made it conducive for teams like the Rangers to buy out of their problems and gave everybody the compliance buyouts. But just think about it in terms of that. So you go into that 2013-14 season, you're kind of floating around. You've been okay. You have the one really good season under Tortorella. You get bounced in the second round the year after, and we're going to talk about that one in a minute, actually. But you frame this team around Stamkos, Lundqvist, Ryan McDonough for the better part of the 2010s. Who's to say? Maybe they don't need to go out and get Rick Nash. Maybe they can just roll with Gaborik and Stamkos. And if they don't trade Dubinsky, you have Dubinsky, and you have Stepan, and you have Kreider. And really quickly, you can start to lay the foundation of a team with a long runway. And that was really kind of where a lot of the further ones down the road on this episode we're going to get to come from, is that you make this decision then, and this does this in turn down the road. You get 20-year-old Steven Stamkos and drop him on a team that's 3 years away from going to a Stanley Cup final. I think you can have a very different conversation and a very different outlook. That Rangers team that got to the Cup final, it was a real struggle in that Cup final. The games were very close, but every single game was white knuckle, hold on to your butts, and we're going to try our best to survive and to hang around. You have a player of Stamkos' caliber on that team. You're having a very different conversation about that entire iteration of the Rangers. That entire 5-year window looks entirely different.
Well, let's think about this from this perspective. The blurb from Larry Brooks says the Rangers were hoping the Lightning were supposed to pick 2 to 3 names from this list. Let's say, obviously we have the power of hindsight, but let's just say best case scenario, the Rangers trade Michael Del Zotto and Evgeny Grachev plus insert picks here for Steven Stamkos. That's obviously best case scenario with hindsight, all these, but let's just pretend that that's the case. So you trade Michael Del Zotto, who, he's a puck-moving defenseman at the time, but as we soon come to find out, not the best player in the world. Also,
a solid NHLer. He had a long career.
Also, at the time, liked to reach out to various adult film stars.
That was later. That was like 2012 or 13. That was a little bit later.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not saying that all happened at the same exact time, but that was a wild time on Twitter to be around that era. But you still have Cali, you still have Dubinsky, you still have Dan Girardi. Let's just pretend that that's the case. This team all of a sudden now has a powerhouse of a goaltender, a powerhouse of a defenseman in Ryan McDonough, and also now a powerhouse of a first line player in Steven Stamkos. I still, do they trade for Marty St. Louis? I think they still try to. I don't know if Tampa, like you said, would take that because, they did trade their now franchise center away for a bag of chips comparatively. So I don't know, would they still do it? Maybe, maybe not. I do think the Rangers would have still made an accompanying move. If not St. Louis, then maybe for somebody else in that same level to really bolster that top 6. I think if it's not St. Louis, then it's a name adjacent to somebody like that. And I think the Rangers, either if they don't win the Cup in maybe 2014 or maybe earlier, or who knows, maybe in 2012, maybe Steven Stamkos scores 6 goals against the Devils, and then they win the series and they move on to the to LA in 2012, and maybe they beat LA in 2012, and maybe they can the entire history book has been rewritten completely. I think this conversation really highlights how important it is to have a franchise forward.
Yeah, that's been the Rangers' issue, even with somebody of Panarin's caliber. And we've said it before. The only season of a forward Henrik Lundqvist had to anything remotely close to what Panarin's done as a Ranger was that first season of Jágr. And after that, they had good individual seasons. Nash had 40 goals. Gaborik had, I want to say, a 90-something point season, but nothing on the consistency and on the level, frankly, of where Panarin is at. Where is the next one? Here we go. This is the next one I have, and these are in chronological order. So a little bit of a surprise, and I went back and read the clips about this, and from what I remembered at the time and what was in the clips, it seemed like the front office was ready to run back Tortorella after they lost in 2012 to the Bruins, not 2012, 2013, excuse me, to the Bruins in that second round series. But the exit interviews really kind of painted a picture of we kind of need to go in a different direction. And this particular type of sliding doors is especially interesting with the Rangers because they've missed really good candidates by a year so many times. You think about Bruce Cassidy, they missed him by a year. They missed Jim Montgomery by a year. In this case, the one we're about to talk about, they missed Barry Trotz by a single year. And you think about what the 2014 to 2020 window looks like. If Barry Trotz is the Rangers coach and he doesn't go to Washington, does Washington break through? Do the Rangers reorganize their team around defense and goaltending the way that Nashville team and the way the Washington teams were? And really quickly, you start to think, well, how different could the Rangers have been by, say, 2014, 2015? Because let's say Tortorella doesn't get fired after 2013. He comes in 13, 14. We're going to safely assume that team does not reach that ceiling. It does not get to the Stanley Cup final. It's probably a playoff team. You wonder, would they be willing to trade Ryan Callahan with Tortorella still being the coach? I think that's probably a little more, I would say, contentious, that somebody that really exhibited what Tortorella wanted, and a captain and a player. And instead, you keep Callahan, and you need to reorganize that. And the next slide is in this season as well. And I bring up Callahan because you got to remember, him and Girardi were both expiring contracts this summer. That after this season, 13-14 going into the summer of 14-15, they were both free agents. That was part of the logic of this trade, the Callahan for St. Louis trade, which did happen. And then the one on our next slide, which we're going to talk about. But as far as realizing their potential and maximizing their opportunities, I do think the Rangers probably have a longer runway last decade if the coach is Barry Trotz as opposed to Alain Vigneault. It's not that Vigneault did an awful job, especially at the beginning.
His lineup decisions were some of the worst I've ever seen.
I think Vigneault is going to never... I think Vigneault is not as bad as we all anecdotally feel like he was, but the bad was egregious, and we're going to get there shortly. There's another one that flows off of this on this topic as well, but you think Vigneault got them pretty close to the ceiling of what that group was. They had the injuries, they had the questionable lineup decisions, and you're left to wonder, well, if they don't have Alain Vigneault, the team probably doesn't regress or decline probably as quickly as it does. If it's Trotz, what does that do for the front office? Because, say there was only the GM for 2 more years after this decision. In 2015, Jeff Gorton takes over as the general manager, and that changes the way the structure of the organization works. I am inclined to worry less about these coaching ones because I think coaching is so player dependent, especially in hockey. This isn't like football sliding doors where if you hire Kyle Shanahan as opposed to Kellen Moore, you're going to have a very different outlook. But I do think this one in particular was worth talking about because that group only broke through because they had Vigneault. You think about the differences in the team under Tortorella versus under Vigneault, and they're very different teams, much more offensively inclined. The power plays were both bad. We all know that, but at least schematically and possession-wise, these teams are really good possession-wise. I say it all the time. The last Ranger team to be positive possession-wise for a full season was 2014-15. We're going on 10 years of the Rangers being a negative possession team. And for all of the warts, for how bad it ended, and how like just condescending he was at the end, he did get a good result out of this group.
I think the one thing from everything that you said I disagree with you with is the Ryan Callahan trade. I do think ultimately, yes, while like if Tortorella were to stay, would that trade have gone through? I think Tortorella would not have maybe been as big of a fan of it as maybe AV was. But I think, Marty St. Louis won the cup in 2004 with Tortorella. I think Tortorella would have been perfectly fine with getting Marty St. Louis. I'm sure, that would have been a conversation between him and the front office. But I do think he would have been okay with it. Ryan Callahan is the warrior and the glue guy that Tortorella loved, sure. But I do think that because St. Louis and Tortorella have that history, I do think that trade still happens. But to the extent of success that the Rangers had, would they have had it under Tortorella? I mean, it's a really difficult question because of the differing styles of play. It's tough because I think Tortorella wouldn't have made such interesting, let's say, lineup decisions as AV made throughout his tenure, but would they have made it as far with Tortorella and his system that they did with AV? It's an impossible question, but I do think at least that trade still goes through.
I think you're probably right, but I did want to bring it up because it makes sense as far as the tangents off of if you do this, then what happens here? Yeah. After this year, that's the season they trade Gaborik for Derek Brassard and John Moore. I don't know if you would have been able to pull that trade off midseason. And you think about, well, if they don't trade those guys and they roll with some combination of Stamkos, Kreider, Stepan, Dubinsky, Anisimov, if you don't trade for Rick Nash, that sets you up where you're going to have way too many forwards. And very clearly, you would have had to make a trade at some point. The Rangers did level up their depth. They did what you want to do when you're building out your organization. Mm-hmm. You turn Dubinsky and Anisimov into a 60, 70 point two-way forward in Nash, one of the better two-way forwards of his era. And then you were able to turn Rick Nash into first-round pick, Ryan Lindgren, and some other stuff down the road, which ultimately helped you out too. So there are a lot of levels to this that you got to think about. This one's a little more up in the air as to how far along this actually was, but I'd mentioned before that Ryan Callahan and Dan Girardi were both expiring contracts. There was purportedly some outlook of a trade between the Rangers and the Ducks where the Rangers would be getting one of the Duck young defensemen. I know it's been a long time, but the Ducks did used to be good. The Ducks were pretty consistently good with that Getzlaf and Perry core, and it was largely through their back end with guys like Sami Vatanen, guys like Cam Fowler. They had the tandem of John Gibson and Freddie Anderson where they were really good defensively. They were physical. You think about guys like Jakob Silfverberg, Andre Kasha, really good forward groups. But they were a physical, a hard-nosed team. People forget it now. The West used to be gnarly. The West used to be really physical, really difficult to play in. And those Sharks teams, those Kings teams, these Ducks teams, they were all big, physical, and nasty. And if you're a team like the Ducks, somebody like Girardi, who's block shots, who plays with that physical edge, and you're trying to level up your group, you want a little more experience, especially on your back end as you're building out your team. And then you think about what that would do for the Rangers, whether it's Vatanen or Fowler, I think that depends on your mindset of, do we want the lefty or the righty? I did Fowler in this case, but it very well could have been Sami Vatanen as well. If it's Sami Vatanen, that's who's riding shotgun with Ryan McDonagh. It's very straightforward. Right-handed defenseman. You're trading your number one right-handy. You need a replacement one. If you have him in the mix, you don't extend Girardi, then you don't have to make that as difficult of a decision the next summer when it comes to Anton Strahlman and Mark Stahl. You could have just kept both, and then you have both of those guys going down. That's your second pair. These two with Fowler with McDonagh, and then Stahl with Strahlman, run it back again. And you are left with that's a bit more mobile. That's a bit closer to what I want the Rangers D to look like. And instead, because of this, they go out and get Dan Boyle. They let Anton Strahlman walk. They don't like what Dan Boyle does enough that they are willing to burn a first-round pick and Anthony Duclair in a trade for Keith Yandel. if you do not need to go get Keith Yandle if you are able to pull this trade off. If you have Cam Fowler, you don't need to do that. And instead, you either keep Anthony Duclair, or you can turn that first round pick and Anthony Duclair into something even more useful, whether that's one more forward, which I think probably would have been the case in that season in particular, where they needed a little more punch. This is the year they did go out and get Marty St. Louis. They turned Callahan into St. Louis. They burned a lot of picks to turn Ryan Callahan into Marty St. Louis. So if you do that trade and then you do this trade, you get younger on the back end. You set yourself up where you're able to kind of ease that decline. And we'll talk about that soon, because one of the topics I have in the Sliding Doors What Ifs is a lot more around that long view. But I do think that this is, of all of the trades, I do think this one it's kind of small, but I do think this one would have probably had the largest impact in terms of success rate, because they're very different teams. If Dan Girardi's not on the 15, 16, and 17 teams, if you have a young guy like Cam Fowler, who is still on the Ducks, by the way, it's a very different conversation.
It's interesting to think about this trade within the context of this is going all in on the short term. And I say that because Cam Fowler would have demanded a lot of money with this next contract. And if the Rangers give that to him, then how does that impact the Rangers now? Like, the Cam Fowler right now is nearing the end of an 8-year contract. He was given a new one in 2018, 2019. So he's still on that $6.5 million cap hit until the end of next season. So let's say the Rangers traded for him and gave him the same contract. He would still be here. So how would that have impacted the way the Rangers have made moves up until this point? If Cam Fowler was a Ranger, that would probably means no Jacob Trouba. That maybe that means no Patrick Kane. Maybe they go after somebody else. Maybe they still get Kane, and because he's cheaper than Jacob Trouba, maybe they get somebody else on top of Patrick Kane. A couple of years ago, maybe they have more space to acquire, a better player this upcoming deadline. I mean, there's a lot of trickle down effects that comes still to this day because Cam Fowler is on this very long-term contract. Now, in the, if Anaheim called me back then and was like, hey, we'll take Dan Girardi for Cam Fowler, and we'll give you Cam Fowler, I would have driven Dan Girardi to the airport myself.
Fowler was 22 years old that season, and you would have had his entire prime. You would have had his entire prime. And you could have either unloaded your position in 2017-18 like they did in real life, or he could have been your veteran old guy on the bad team. So I do agree with you in that perspective. But the one thing I would say to push back slightly is, they would have just given the Girardi money to Fowler, because Girardi got like 5.5, 6, I think. Yeah, it's right there on the screen. I'm blind. Don't mind me. He got 5.5. The Ducks gave Fowler a 5-year deal that was worth $4 million per. If they give Fowler that, you don't go get Yandle, you don't go get Boyle, you roll back Strawman and Girardi, Strawman and Stahl, and then you got to figure out that bottom half. They're your bottom defensive pair. But at the very least,
figuring out the bottom 6 is a lot easier than figuring out your top 4.
That is true. That is very, very true. The next one I have up here, this one, I think this one and the next one are very tied to each other. But I talked about Coach Sliding Doors before. I think every Ranger fan was kind of in agreement that they should have fired Vigneault for how the 2017 series against the Senators went. That was an abomination.
Oh yeah, it's one of the worst coaching jobs I've ever seen in the playoffs. I mean, it was so bad, and it's I can't even put into words how bad it was, because again, the Rangers were so favored in that series. Ottawa really had no business being there. They were there to have a good time. They were there for vibes at that point. Like, they shouldn't have been there. And AV with his atrocious deployment cost the Rangers that series. It was that bad. The Rangers, I think it was Girardi and Stahl and those guys kept getting scored on. Every time they'd be on the ice, they kept getting scored on. And AV never changed. He kept getting the same people back with the same deployment every time he could, and it never ended well, and he never changed his approach, and that ruined the Rangers that series. it's one of the worst coaching jobs I've ever seen from a team that should have had a lot more success than they did that year because of just a coach's complete inability to say that he was wrong and to change his approach mid-game. I mean, that series went, 6 games?
Yeah.
You had like a week and a half to change your deployment, brother. Like you never did.
And you lost 2 games in overtime.
It was awful. It was awful. And he should have been fired after that series easily. And I think if you go to 2024, like if this happened now, I think Drury would have fired him right then and there.
And that lends itself to an interesting thought. And it's tied to the next one, so I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I did want to read this. So in the third period of game 2 in that series, the Rangers lose that game 6-5 in overtime. Gabriel Pageau scores 1641, 1858, and 254 in overtime. They give up 3 straight goals. Mark Stahl and Nick Holden are on the ice for 2 of the 3 goals. Girardi and McDonough are on the ice for the third of the 3 goals.
Of course, right.
When you look at the minutes allocation in that series, the discomfort, and you got to remember, they went out and burned picks to get Brendan Smith, and him and Brady Shea were playing pretty well together. They were the third pair. They didn't get a lot of minutes. They were effective. You can make the argument, well, they were getting easier matchups, fewer minutes, lighter workload. To Rangers' point, at some point, you would have thought, well, we're losing to the team we were heavily favored to beat. We're getting outplayed right now by Craig Anderson, who's 40 years old. We can't beat 40-year-old Craig Anderson and a team with 5 good forwards. Yeah, Mark Stone is great. Erik Karlsson is great. We're losing to Kyle Turris and Jean-Gabriel Pageau. At some point, there needed to be somebody in that room, and they just didn't have it. They did not have it, and I really do think that's the worst playoff series of the last 15 years. I really do think since Lundqvist took over as the starter, that's the worst series loss.
Yeah.
If you want to argue the Buffalo series, if that 07 or 08 where they choked the bed in that one game and they would have went up 3-1, sure, maybe, whatever.
Maybe.
They weren't favored to win that series against Buffalo. This Ottawa team was not that good.
It's 2 different series. The one against Buffalo, they should have won for sure. But this series, it should not have even went 6.
No,
like that's how big of a discrepancy the talent gap was. The Rangers were so much deeper on every level. They had one of the best goalies on the planet also helping them along the way, and you lose to 2 really good guys and some guys off the street because your head coach refused to accept that his decisions weren't the best. Like that's just, it's completely inexcusable. And the fact that he wasn't fired right then and there, that's an unserious decision.
Where is it? I want to sort by time on ice. Yes, that's right. It was Tanner Glass who got into Game 6 over Buchnevich. That's right. Yeah, Glass got 8 minutes to play in Game 6.
Right.
Regardless, the next one is tied to this one, so I'll bring it up now. If there's no bubble, there's no starting over, there's no everybody expectations, because I really do think that season that gets cut short, 1920, I think the fact that the Rangers got in the Fugazi playoffs really messed them up. I really do think that by getting in those playoffs that year, that really kind of messed with everyone's perception of time. That, oh, we made the playoffs and we got the first overall pick. And all these guys we've drafted are ready to come into the league and start making waves. And they immediately started burning all of their flexibility. They give Zibanejad the extension. They give Fox the extension. They give Trocheck that contract. They trade all of these draft picks. They acquire Nemeth and Reeves and Gaudreau. And they trade Buchnevich for Blais. All because they think they're ready because they made the fake playoffs. And we are never probably going to get an honest answer about that 2021 season, the 56-game season. I just want to know, did the Rangers really think that I think they were 30-1 to win the Stanley Cup, 35-1 to win the Stanley Cup going into that season, the season after they had just picked first overall? I want to know if James Dolan really thought they were going to make the playoffs, and that's why everybody got fired, because they missed the playoffs. Or if he got pissed off that the most expensive player he's ever had got thrown around like a rag doll. I want to know. it doesn't matter in hindsight. We're 4 years removed from that this upcoming year. It doesn't matter anymore. I just want to know, because you think about how slow Ken Hughes and Jeff Gorton have played it in Montreal, where they're still in the early stages of that assembly process. You think about where the Rangers could be right now in that process if they don't go out and do that. And I know that's a little bit disingenuous because it was Gorton and Davidson who gave Panarin the big contract, trade for Trouba, all of those kind of moves to kind of speed up the process. I get it. But I think those are more of holding pattern moves as opposed to we're trying to win right now moves. And you got to wonder, there's no bubble. Do they make the playoffs? If they don't make the playoffs in 2020 or 2021, is that 2022 season? Does David Quinn get another year because they're realistic about their expectations? What does that do to the development of Kakko and Lafreniere and K'Andre Miller and Braden Schneider? All of this, I think this is probably the most consequential one because it's the front office. And it's not a secret. We're not the biggest fans of the way Chris Drury handled the early stages of his tenure as general manager. And I think a lot of those were based on the premise that we're pretty close already, even though they weren't close. They finished, I think 7 points back of the last playoff spot in that 56-game season. And that was with a lot of guys hurt down the stretch of that season.
I actually think it doesn't matter if there's a bubble or not. I don't think it matters. I think Dolan still wants and expects playoffs every year, no matter what. Barring a complete teardown, I think he still expects playoffs. And I kind of think, could, some things have been changed or, within the margins have been different? Yeah, maybe. But I still think most of the same outcomes happen. I think, okay, if they don't make the playoffs, but they still get the first overall pick, I think next year plays out the same exact way with the same exact hirings and firings and trades and stuff. I think it's the same thing.
Okay. Off of that,
yeah,
I'm going to tie in one last one because it's also tied to that. This is the other one. If Christopher really thought he was getting Eichel and then didn't and still did the Buchnevich trade anyway, I don't know why we're having a conversation here. And you can say, oh, well, things change. It's fluid. I might be stupid. I know not to pay until the goods are delivered. When you make a deal with somebody to do your sidewalk or to paint your house, there is an expectation that you're going to pay a little bit up front. You're going to put a deposit down so that parties are held to an agreement that, okay, I'm going to give you half up front, then you're going to paint my house. And as long as you did a good job, you'll get the rest of it. If it doesn't go well and you need to reapply, you need to redo a part, we'll negotiate. We'll revisit that once that happens. This deal, whatever you want to say, I think it's very funny to think about what the conversation was 3-4 years ago of, well, no, they couldn't do Kakko and Lafreniere. They couldn't do that. You're telling me now, even if Lafreniere is going to be a 70, 80 point guy, I think you take the chance to get Eichel on the same team as Panarin and say, we'll figure it out later. It really does seem to be that simple to me. And I know then people will say, oh, well, then who's the 2C? Because if you were going to trade for Eichel, you probably would have had to put Zibanejad in that package because he was one of the few guys who didn't have a no trade and was, a functional top 6 forward.
Oh,
that Buffalo would have wanted.
You had to trade Zibanejad.
As long as I live, I am never going to forget the people who tried to tell me Zibanejad was better than Eichel 3 and 4 years ago. People whose job it was to write about professional hockey. One of those people suggests, well, the Rangers could get Kuznetsov, and he's 80% of Eichel. That would work if they ran Zibanejad and Kuznetsov as their 1-2.
Yeah, right. It's just, right on, baby.
The Rangers have always done this. There was one I was going to put in here that I didn't. Remember when they told the Oilers no for a first-round pick for Cam Talbot in 2015?
Yeah.
Midway through that season? It's a good thing they didn't. Lundqvist did get hurt. Talbot did have to play quite a few games in that President's Trophy season. That's a different permutation there. If you remember, he got hit in the throat with that puck because Girardi's stick was in his mask and it threw his neck up. But the Rangers have always overvalued their own guys. As good as Lafreniere might end up being, Eichel's a top 30, 40 player in the sport. I think there's a good chance Lafreniere is never a top 30 or 40 player in the sport. You see what Eichel's already done, and the only knock on him is, can he stay healthy? And it hasn't been tied to the neck. If it was his neck that was still chronically a problem and holding him back, then it's a different conversation. No. He's just an injury-prone guy, whether it's his lower body, he had an arm thing, he had a shoulder thing. Regardless, you have Eichel, you have Panarin, you have Fox, you have Shesterkin. You're in a better place than you are right now. And there are people who say, well, they couldn't make the money work. I did the math. You could have had Eichel, Buchnevich, Panarin, Fox, Shesterkin, everybody on the team. If you just took Zibanejad's $5.5 million out for that one season, you could have had Eichel on the team that went to the conference final under Gerard Gallant in 2021, 2022. You could have him and Buchnevich with Chris Kreider as your first line. You could have still had Ryan Strome and Artemi Panarin and whoever on that right wing, whether it ends up being Frank Vetrano. And you don't need to go out and get Frank Vetrano and Tyler Mott that offseason at that deadline, because you have a first-line center who can generate offense at 5-on-5. At some point, you got to ask yourself these questions. And this one irks me the most, because if it really came down to the Sabres said, well, we're not trading him to the Rangers, you should have blew them away. You should have blew them away with the best. But you go look at what Vegas gave up for Eichel. Come on, you tell me the Rangers couldn't do better than that? Yeah. Even if he had to pay 1.5 times the price. Eichel is that type of player. It's the same thing with Stamkos. It's the exact same trade frame
situation. Yeah,
it's the same exact type.
This is once again, and the argument is that Panarin is a franchise-altering forward, and he is,
but he's not a center.
Right. Well, one, he's not a center. Yeah, and two, Jack Eichel has that screw it, I'm going to go do it myself type of offensive gene in him. Come playoff time, we saw it in Vegas. My man's did it plenty of times en route to that Stanley Cup, where Jack Eichel said, I have the puck on my stick. I will skate 200 feet if I have to, but I'm going to generate offense because I'm that good. Get out of my way. I'm going to do it. The Rangers do not have that kind of player offensively. They don't.
No.
And Jack Eichel would have completely changed the dynamic of the Rangers offense. And again, this is the same conversation we have with Stamkos. Stamkos is another one of those players that is so gifted offensively that he can take the puck on his stick, say, everybody get out of my way. I'm going to score no matter what happens to me, and I'm going to go get this done. Stamkos can do that. Jack Eichel can do that. Panarin sometimes can do it if he wants to, but not really in the playoffs from, especially moments that the Rangers have really needed him to do that, in close games or when they're down a game in the series. Panarin hasn't done that as much as somebody making that kind of money should be doing or is expected to be doing. He hasn't done that. Jack Eichel can do that. Steven Stamkos can do that, have done it to Stanley Cup winning success. This would have completely changed the dynamic of the team. Losing Lafreniere, if it would have came to that, would have been tough. Losing Capo Caco,
it probably would have worked out in Buffalo anyway, so you wouldn't feel as bad.
I guess, but this would have changed the dynamic of the team. This would have brought in a true offensively dynamic dynamo that the Rangers haven't had in a very long time. And we look at all of these cup winning teams, and all of them have at least one top superstar forward that can do that can get the puck on their stick and say, all right, I don't care if there's prime Bobby Orr on the other team that's on the ice right now. I'm going to skate by him and I'm going to score a goal. The Rangers do not have that forward. They could have had one with Jack Eichel. They could have had one with Steven Stamkos, but instead they have, Mika Zibanejad, and that's it.
It really is. It's been the Rangers' biggest issue over the last 20 years. You can go back to the Jágr iterations of the team. He was the best forward in the world that first season.
Yep.
The Rangers lost to the Devils in 5 games in the first round that year. It didn't ultimately end up mattering. Okay, Andrew, you said you had a few.
I do, yeah. The number one thing that I have on the list is July 1st, 2007. The New York Rangers give Scott Gomez a 7-year contract for $51.5 million.
Yeah.
What if the Rangers did not give him that contract? And I asked that question because that's the contract that they traded to Montreal to ultimately get Ryan McDonough. What if that doesn't happen?
they're probably hunting for that defenseman in the draft. I would have to go and look at like the 08, 09, 2010 drafts to see who would have been in the ballpark of where they were picking, because that's ultimately the answer. And that was frankly the big knock on Glenn Sather's drafting, was he was drafting for need and consistently taking guys way ahead of where they should have gone, because he felt that's what the Rangers needed. You know, McElrath is the obvious one you can point to. Bobby Santagutti over Giroux you can point to. Where if you go and look at the drafts of the years right after Gomez, and they trade for McDonough in 2009, I think, if I remember correctly, 2008 or 2009. You know, they draft Del Zotto in 2008.
June 30th, 2009. The trade was Gomez with Tom Pyatt, Rangers legend Tom Pyatt, and Michael Busto to the Montreal Canadiens for Chris Higgins, Doug Janik, Ryan McDonough, and Pavel Valentinko.
Yeah, I mean, they draft Del Zotto the year after in 2000. They draft Del Zotto in 08. They don't draft any defensemen who make it to the league in 2009. The only defenseman they draft that makes it to the league in 10 is McElrath, and has 75 games played in 2024. JT Miller's a forward. They draft Brady Shea in 2012. You know, it's a very different team. You know, maybe they're hunting on that veteran defenseman market as opposed to hunting for Rick Nash or Marty St. Louis. Maybe they're trying to get, like, when Mark Giordano comes back from Russia, maybe they try and get Mark Giordano as a free agent, because if you remember, he went to Russia for 2 years in the middle of his career. Those types of things, where it's an interesting question, because it's not really a straightforward answer, because you would have to find the best left-handed defenseman you possibly could, and you'd have to scour the market. Maybe it's Ryan Suter. Maybe they give Ryan Suter the terrible contract that Minnesota ends up giving him, because that happens 2 years out. That's 2011 or 12, I believe. Ryan Suter goes to the Wild. Yeah, because Parise leaves the Devils after 12. Him and Suter signed the same year, so 2012. So it takes 3 years to get Ryan Suter.
I am going to push back a little bit on that, because I think them signing together was a
package deal. Yeah.
Because I remember they signed the same contract for the same money. Like, they were a package deal. They wanted to
go to Minnesota
and play together there. So I don't think Ryan Suter would have been on the table for them, because those two were so set. I mean, they were so set, they signed the exact same dollar value. Like, that's how, close they were, and that's how, they wanted to play. So, Ryan Suter, I don't know if that would have been on the cards, but that would have changed a whole lot. And, it's funny, because obviously Montreal would not have liked that. They would love a mulligan on that trade, but that's a big domino effect, because, okay, well, if you don't sign Scott Gomez, who do you sign for that contract? And let's say it goes better than what Scott Gomez did. Okay, well, then you probably don't trade whoever's contract that is, and then you don't get Ryan McDonough by accident, essentially by accident. Like, that was an accidental, oh my God, we got a great defenseman type of deal. Like, yes, I think he was a first round.
Yeah, I think selection. It was 12th overall.
So, yeah, I mean, the Rangers knew who he was, and the Canadiens knew who they were giving up, but I don't think either side expected Ryan McDonough to be this, a top 2 defenseman on Stanley Cup contending teams like that. Like, that's the best case scenario for somebody like that. And Ryan McDonough ended up being essentially best case scenario. So, and Scott Gomez, let's just say, did not have a best case scenario type of career with the Montreal Canadiens. But that is such a big domino effect, because, okay, well, if you don't sign Scott Gomez, who do you sign? You don't get Ryan McDonough, then who's your replacement? How does the rest of the team shape out? Because when you get Ryan McDonough, you get, and he starts playing, you quickly realize, oh, this is a really good defenseman. And then the Rangers start building around him, and then they start adding pieces. And then that's how the 2012 core happens, and, et cetera. If they don't get Ryan McDonough, what now? Now what? Because now
Del Zotto is probably the first pair defenseman.
Maybe, but
it's Del Zotto and Girardi.
Well, what if he struggles in the first pairing role, and then you have to go get somebody to fill that role, because Del Zotto can't do it. Okay,
maybe it's Mark Stahl. Maybe Mark Stahl doesn't get hurt.
Maybe,
and Mark Stahl is the first pair guy for most of the 2010s.
I was at that game.
Yeah, I do recall you mentioning that. Here's a counterpoint one to you. There's zero chance in hell Chris Drury is the general manager of the team right now if they don't sign him that day. 0% chance.
Maybe.
I think based on what we know about James Dolan, the way Glenn Sather got the job, the way Chris Drury got the job, the way that Jeff Gorton got the job, it's very clear he likes people who are nice to him. It's very clear that he likes people he can schmooze with and feel included with. That part of the reason Chris Drury is the general manager of the team right now is that James Dolan actually remembered him. One of the few players that James Dolan could probably pick out of a lineup down the road, 5 years go by in 2011. And it didn't end well for Drury in New York. He had 2 good seasons, then the injuries accumulated. He retired pretty young. I want to say like 33 years old, which is pretty young to just retire entirely. Yeah. So I do think that's one to revisit. Hit me with your next one.
I have one that's so relevant to this day, and that is, what if the Senators don't trade Zibanejad for Derek Brassard? The full trade was back in 2016. The Senators, for some reason, traded Mika Zibanejad, who was 22 years old at the time and was essentially going to be their first-line center because they didn't really have anybody else, and a second-round pick in 2018 for Derek Brassard, who was coming off a good year, but he was, considerably older than 22, and a 7th-round pick in 2018. What if the Senators actually had a decent GM that was like, wait a minute, this trade doesn't sound right. I'm not going to make this trade.
Ottawa's probably pretty good. Yeah. If you have Zibanejad, you have Mark Stone, you have Gabriel Pajot, you have Erik Karlsson, you probably have a pretty solid core of a team. If Zibanejad is there, maybe Mark Stone doesn't and Karlsson don't end up leaving. They probably needed to figure out that goalie situation. I probably think that's been the weak link basically since Andrew Hammond's Linsanity run ended, is they haven't been able to get consistent goaltending. For the Rangers, I think their rebuild is longer. I think that's probably the repercussion. They were able to get Zibanejad when they were still trying to be competitive. They still thought, okay, we're going to turn to Brassard, who's 28 or 29, into a 22-year-old. Zibanejad plays on the 3rd line that first year, and then they trade Derek Stepan at the draft the following year for Tony DeAngelo and a pick. They used that pick on Lias Andersson, I think. They use it on Lias Andersson, or I forget if it's that one or Kravtsov, whatever. The pick doesn't end up mattering. Tony DeAngelo doesn't end up mattering, but they still try to be competitive, and that's ultimately what undoes them. If they emphasize more hockey trades as opposed to futures trades, they could have stayed competitive. They did not need to go down to the studs. Sure. They still had term on some of those guys. They could have probably made it work with McDonough, with JT Miller, with Rick Nash, all of those guys who were on expiring, and in Miller's case, a restricted free agent. They could have made the money work. They could have found a way to stay competitive. They would have had to cut off some parts. They couldn't afford to keep everybody, but they could have been a fringe playoff team with Zuccarello, with Kevin Hayes, with Rick Nash, with Stepan, etc. But because they make that Zibanejad trade, they start transitioning towards that next year. They get DeAngelo. Then the year after that, they really load up. They draft Lias Andersson, and Kravtsov. Then the year after that, you get Miller, and you start building it out. And as much as Jeff Gorton's decisions, especially towards the end, started to frustrate me, I at least saw the vision. I understood they were trying to accumulate as many assets as possible and trying to build out a team cheap. That was their goal. Have a cheaper roster as possible so that when a Panarin becomes available, you go out and get him. That was their strategy. That's what they're doing in Montreal right now. They are going to keep turning over that roster. They're going to wait for Gallagher and Josh Anderson to retire or move on. They're going to try and get that Carey Price money off the books and really gradually build a team around Slafkovsky, around Suzuki, around Caulfield, among the 9 defensemen they've drafted over the last 3 years. I don't know which has more merit. I still think you probably push the chips in on Panarin and Trouba when you do, because you figure it out down the road. Whenever you get a player of that caliber at the time, you figure it out down the road because you're trying to get as good as you can. Now, in hindsight, there's an argument you might not do that. There's an argument you might slow play it and not burn all that money and all those assets that early.
It did accelerate the, we have to do things now mentality, where I think the Rangers still maybe would have had that if the trade didn't go through. But this particular move, I think, really kicked it into overdrive.
Yes.
Where if Ottawa had a GM that actually, said no to things and understood, hey, maybe don't
all
make
we
this
got
trade.
for Erik Karlsson is Erik Brannstrom, who got non-tendered.
Yeah. That's Ottawa's had a long history of let's just say not the best.
Wait, no, that's what he got for Mark Stone. But still.
Just Ottawa has had a big history of not the best roster decisions. Let's just put it that way. So if Ottawa has a functioning GM that, says no to things, that actually understands, oh, we have a 22-year-old future franchise center. Let's not trade him and a second round pick for an older center who maybe did marginally better that year and a seventh, and we're gonna completely blow the team apart when they didn't really have to do that. And that trade didn't make sense for Ottawa at the time, and it makes even less sense now. I mean, it's easy to call out a trade in hindsight and be like, oh, well, the trade didn't work out pieces wise, or the fit just wasn't there. But I could see the vision. No, there was no vision with that trade. It didn't make sense the day it happened, and it only makes less sense now. So for Ottawa's sake, I don't understand why they made that trade still to this day, but it worked out for the Rangers. The one other one that I wanted to bring up to you was, what if the Rangers don't draft Dylan McIlrath and they either draft Cam Fowler or Vladdy Tarasenko?
They probably win the Stanley Cup. It's really that straightforward. You add one more elite top six forward to a team as opposed to a guy whose highlight was fighting Wayne Simmons one time after Simmons broke McDonough's face. That was the pinnacle of Dylan McIlrath's time as a Ranger. Trying to draft Jeff Bukaboom in 2010, not amongst Glenn Sather's finest moments.
That draft still frustrates me to this day. It's tough because, again, if they do draft Cam Fowler, well, then does Dan Girardi have that kind of contract? Does he stay on this team for long? Do they end up trading Dan Girardi for somebody? Maybe they trade Dan Girardi for a forward, and they keep Cam Fowler long term, and then they build out the team that way. Or if they trade Tarasenko, well, okay, does that mean maybe another young forward from the team goes to make room for him? Maybe that, I don't know how they would go about doing that, but you have to think, okay, well, if the top line forwards for the team back then was still Kreider, which is a while to think about because it's now, a long time since then, and my man's is still anchoring the first line or the de facto second line for the Rangers in 2024, then, I would have liked to see what the Rangers would have done with Tarasenko. And also the question remains is because the Rangers haven't done a really great job at developing talent. So the question becomes, okay, well, you draft Cam Fowler, you draft Tarasenko. Do they still, I think figures it out. I would think they still, do more things in the NHL than Dylan McIlrath did for sure. But do they become the top talents that they are / were? Because the Rangers are
Tarasenko, I think, figures it out.
Developing team in the NHL.
You got to remember, because Tarasenko stays over in the KHL for a few more years. Yeah. He has that really slow first season with St. Louis, and then he's clearly a guy. He has 2 40-goal seasons. Fowler's a bit more of an interesting conversation, especially whether or not, behind McDonough, does he usurp McDonough in the pecking order? What does that do to Mark Stahl? The trickle downs of Fowler are a bit more interesting because I think ultimately, as much as we've spent this episode talking about the Rangers' lack of high-end forward talent, if their defense isn't as bad in 15 and 16 and 17, they probably don't need to tear it all the way down to the studs. Maybe there's a world where the Rangers are decent in 2019 with JT Miller, Kevin Hayes down the middle, Artemi Panarin and Chris Kreider on wings, and whomsoever on the right side. You figure it out because, if you do those, then the other opportunities. But there's a world where they're not awful, where it's JT Miller, Kevin Hayes, Artemi Panarin, Chris Kreider, Brady Shea. Whether or not you do Adam Fox, you don't know. With Fowler, there is a world where the Rangers don't have to bottom all the way out, and they probably don't get to as high of a ceiling as they are right now because they spent that time as a bad team. Ultimately, and this will be my parting thought before I throw it back over to you and we get out of here, the better you are for the longer period of time, the more difficult the aftermath is. Pittsburgh and Washington, they're probably going to be awful for half a decade once their windows respectively close. When Sid and Malkin and Letang all hang it up, that's going to be the worst team in the entire NHL for at least 3 or 4 years. Washington, they're trying to stay relevant with the moves they've made. It's going to be ugly when Ovechkin hangs it up and they are just the team of second line guys. And they're going to be very similar to what Seattle is. You look at the shape the Sharks are in right now, the shape the Blackhawks are in right now, where the Ducks are in right now. You know, the Ducks made a conference final 7 years ago. That was the last time they were in the playoffs. 7 years since the last time they were good. The Sharks, it's been 5 years since they were good. The better you are, the longer you are, the harder it is to get better. The Rangers were really good for 7-8 years there, and it took 3 years to get back to being relevant. That's a reasonable trade-off. The longer you're good, the more painful it is.
And it's one of these things is not like the other.
Yes.
Penguins have won Stanley Cups. The Sharks didn't, but they were often, they were in the Rangers boat for like the Sharks were so close, just like the Rangers were for such a long time, and that just ended up it all fell apart, and they couldn't get it. They couldn't get it home. But the Caps won, the Ducks won.
They got something to show for
it. The Blackhawks won multiple. So did the Penguins, sure, but most of these teams that we listed, San Jose being the one outlier, have rings to show for their success. And that's the thing here that the Rangers have to realize is, do you want long-term playoff success where you get close, but you never make it like San Jose and like the Rangers have been for the better part of, a decade plus? Or do you want silver hardware? Those that's, and I know that's a very simple question to ask. And obviously, given the choice, everybody would pick winning a Stanley Cup and being, I guess, good for less periods of time. But if you want the Stanley Cup, you have to build your team to do so. You need that franchise centerpiece that can take over a shift, take over a game, and say, get out of my way. I'm going to score a goal. We're going to win this game. Whether the other team wants this to happen or not, I'm going to make this happen. The Rangers don't have that player. The Rangers needed to build better defensive depth than they have the past 15 years. They haven't done that. So, okay, well, your goalies being outstanding is great and all, but they also can't score goals, even though Shesterkin has really tried his best in certain moments to do so. He's not skating, out there with the power play guys or on the first line. You need true offensive talent to get this team over the hump.
It's not a 1-to-1. That's the problem. Everybody's going to make that trade. I do think the Capitals method is probably the most replicable of just make the playoffs every year, and 1 year you're going to get lucky. You make the playoffs every year for a decade, you're going to have a reasonable chance. And the Rangers have gotten pretty close a few times. It just takes that one time. And the Rangers, we've talked about this a lot all summer, and we'll get out of here on this. The Rangers have been in the ballpark. They are not going to subtract from being in the ballpark to think they're going to get closer a year or two from now. They are going to keep burning assets until they reach an inflection point. That inflection point might be as soon as next summer. It could be 2 years from now. But that will just about do it for this week's episode of Liberty Blues. So if you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you are listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you are watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell. Let us know which move that we talked about or one that we didn't mention do you think is the most impactful over the last 10, 15 years? Andrew and I will talk to you guys next week.
Later.